what a blessing, Lord. And so we just ask that you would bless us as we continue to seek to grow in discernment of the truth of your word. And ask that in our discussion time today and in this teaching time that your truth will be received in hearts like it, which you have prepared, and me included, that we would all be edified and encouraged in our time together today. We thank you for the season of the spring feast that we are concluding. And we thank you for this special Shabbat in Yeshua's name. Amen. Okay, so we've been talking about, oh, thank you, whoever just, all of a sudden there's water there. We've been talking about all these themes that are interlocking, like fear of God versus fear of man. We've talked about traditions of man versus the word of God. And different types of moments in Scripture where, with the analogy or the parable of this torn garment and an immature response, or a response that is foolish or not careful or too quick to fix, that actually makes a situation worse, rather than acknowledging the truth of the problem and then having God's response. So we're going to continue to kind of use those various threads together as we look at Galatians specifically. And I have, does everybody have here? So there's a page. I wanted to just spend a little bit of time at the start. Looking on page 4. There's it's kind of small print, so those who need readers like me, you might have to get the readers out. But in this good one, it's easier for me to see, actually. So make sure everybody has one. Thank you. All right. Oh, thanks. Thanks, Andrew. So page 4, there's a list of like 32 statements. And these statements are taken from one of the 7 underlined, if you call these are like domains of meaning or something. The Bible is Scripture, of course, but the M is Maccabean. That means it's a rule or a viewpoint that was promoted by the Maccabees, which was, if you remember, the Maccabees is 2nd century BC. The Q represents something that was from the Essene community. The C is something we'd be familiar from in Christian tradition. R, rabbinic, I, Islam, L would be LDS. So, but I want to just do some of these. And if anybody had looked ahead at any of these and has a question, you could take a moment to look at that as well. But there's a method to the madness here with all these statements. It is to recognize how, in a way, it's how religions form. What is it that makes a religious community, and how did they build up that community and kind of fortify it with law, with rules, with rituals, that then they differentiate it then from other religions. Because the world is full of religion, right? Of different groups. And part of our discernment as new creations in Messiah is we want to be able to recognize when something is not from the Word of God. I mean, that's the basic exercise here in terms of like kind of this drilling on our knowledge of certain things. So it might be that some of the statements here are not very familiar to you, and that's okay. Not everybody's going to have been exposed to the same types of teaching, variety of teachings. But for example, number one, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. We looked at that last night. That should, hopefully everybody here knows that's B for Bible, right? That's in Scripture. Now, later, any of these later groups might cite that, but this is just about identifying the foundation. This number two, it says, separate yourself from the Gentiles and do not eat with them. Do not become associates of theirs. Does anybody know where that is? What's that? It's actually, that's Qumran. That's actually the Book of Jubilees. So that's a statement from the Book of Jubilees that obviously had impact in the first century. There were people who, Gentiles, stay away. And number 3 and 4 are another example of first century variants. Number 3, every person who comes against us in battle on the Sabbath, we will war against them. Any ideas? That Maccabean, yeah, that's the Maccabean. What had happened was the enemies knew what day was the Sabbath, and so they attacked Jews on the Sabbath when they were defenseless. And the Maccabees, this is like a torn, there's a garment, and they need to repair. And they're like, what? They took advantage of our Sabbath day, and they killed a bunch of our people. Are we going to let them do it again every Sabbath? So the Maccabees enacted a law that said we will fight. If they come against us on the Sabbath, we will fight. And that's after the policy of not fighting had been taken advantage of by the enemies. So that was instituted by the Maccabees. But look at number 4. As for any man who fasts or makes war on the day of the Sabbath, let him die. So you couldn't be part of both groups, right? That's also Jubilee. So that's in the Qumran. So do you see how at the same time you can have different Jewish groups that have different worldviews or different rules or community law that makes them unable to really fellowship because of the differences. Number 5, you must pray 5 times a day facing Mecca. Islam, right, exactly. Number 6, honor your father and mother. Bible. Okay, so that's what this is about. Some of it might seem really simple, but it is a kind of a little drill, a little brain, like a brain drill, right? To go, I mean that in a quizzy way, not a literal way, to recognize counterfeits, to recognize what is the real thing. And here's why. We're looking at Galatians this afternoon. And there's a passage I'm gonna jump a little bit ahead to chapter 5. And in chapter 5, verse 5, Paul says, for we, through the Spirit, by faith, are waiting for the hope of righteousness. We are waiting for the hope of righteousness. That's a really important verse. Is because what we're going to look at as we go through the different little, what I call vignettes that Paul gives us in Galatians 1 and 2. Each vignette is a scenario where a group is advocating a different definition of righteousness that is going to evoke the insecurities of new believers to want to be an insider, I'm an outsider to that group. They are telling me what righteousness is, and I need to become one of them so that I too can be reckoned as righteous, because that's what's important. I want God to love me. after all? And how can I be sure? How do I know if God loves me or not? Well, each of these groups is going to have, this is how you know, by listening to us and doing things our way. So each of these groups will be promoting if the tear in the garment, so to speak, is a person's thought that I love the God of Israel, yet I don't know if I'm acceptable to him. I love the God of Israel. I want to worship the God of Israel, but I'm a Gentile. I love the God of Israel, but I don't know. I'm confused by all the different denominations. I love the God of Israel, but I don't fill in the blank. So Paul in Galatians is writing to them because these are people he's been to. So for those who got that right on the quiz, good job. Paul had already been to this community and had we don't know how long he was there, but he taught Torah, he taught the gospel, and he moved on his missionary activities. And then he hears word that some other people have come claiming some sort of authority and are troubling the people, that they're teaching things that are undermining the foundation that Paul had laid there, to where these people don't know whether they belong or not. In other words, Paul came preaching that according to the Abrahamic covenant, right, in your seed, all the nations of the world will be blessed, and that Messiah is this seed. And Yeshua is Yeshua is the unity or the unifier, is what brings all these nations together to celebrate and to enjoy this wonderful, beautiful covenant blessing that God has promised. And of course, repentance and forgiveness of sins, like we talked about, is part of that. Well, Paul leaves and moves on, and some people come in and they're twisting some things. And they're twisting things in a way to bring the people off of that message to try to get them to follow them rather than Paul. And they do it by dangling some sort of other definition of what it takes to be righteous. What does it mean to be righteous? What does it mean to know that you belong to God? What is it that a believer needs to have peace with God and to rest in God's love without the doubt? That's the true gospel message. These others are taking that and are teaching, oh, no, you have to do these other things here. Well, if we see, Paul mentions I'm not going to read the whole book. I know you've read a letter many times. In 1:6, he says, I'm amazed that you're so quickly deserting him who called you by the grace of Messiah for a different gospel, which is not another, basically, because there is no other gospel. But there are some who are troubling you or disturbing you and who would distort the gospel of the Messiah. So there is what he's calling the truth of the gospel, which is at stake. And the truth of the gospel is something that, oops, that's not an emergency. I heard a sound.
Our sound is scarier.
Oh. He says, even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to what we have preached, let him be anathema. Is the word. Some say accursed, but it's anathema. It's let him be. Don't touch that. Don't touch it. Stay away from it. have nothing to do with it. That's what it means. As we have said before, now I say again, if anyone is preaching to you a gospel contrary to what you've received, anathema. Don't touch it. Stay far away from it. That's what that means. It doesn't mean curse in the way that it's sometimes translated. And then verse 110, that's the one we had looked at a little bit earlier. For am I now seeking the favor of people or of God? Am I now striving to please men or people? That makes me sense. If I were still trying to please men, I would not be a bondservant, or I would not be a slave of Messiah. So right here, he's making it clear that if you are following Yeshua truly, then you have to recognize these coercive tactics of the conversion groups. And there's more than one, right? It's not just one. They all are wanting their own authority. They're into taking disciples after themselves. They are seeking earthly gains, right? They're not really serving God, but they sprinkle a little bit of God's words on what they do. But what Paul does first is he acknowledges the crisis, if you will, or the problem in Galatia of these false teachers that have come in and are troubling everybody. That means their hearts are troubled, means that their shalom with God they're self-doubting them. They had a confidence hearing Paul teach, and that confidence now has been totally disturbed by what they've been ingesting. And Paul is saying, okay, I'm going to give you a few different scenarios to help you understand the nature of this intense, competitive, coercive Jewish sectarianism that's out there. There are groups that want to build up their own little religions, mini religions of their own view of how to keep the Torah, ultimately what it means to be righteous. Paul says, I would have you know, brothers, that the gospel which was preached by me is not of human invention. I did not receive it from man, nor was I taught it, but through a revelation of Yeshua, the Messiah. And so we know the story of how Paul, you can go and look in the book of Acts, he's on the road to Damascus, and he gets knocked off knocked to the ground, and literally has a direct intervention, if you will, or Yeshua stops him in his tracks. And this is a crucial moment, of course, for the Apostle Paul. And it's what we're going to read here is what he did. It took time for Paul to start to get it was a pretty radical shift. But what he says here, he says, you have heard of my former life in Judaismos. It says Judaism in some translations. Some will say the Jewish religion. And the problem there is it's easy for our English ear to imagine, like if I were to say, you heard that I used to be a Catholic, right? Or something like that. We might hear it that way. Or you knew I used to be a Pentecostal or something like that. And that's not this. That's not how Paul is not talking about an established institutionalized religion here. He's talking about, he describes what it was in terms of a zeal for traditions and a willingness to even go to violent measures to enforce that zealous view of purity, right? National pride, national purity, and to bring back bring back the kingdom of David, bring back the Maccabean. It's advancing in the Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries among my countrymen being more extremely zealous for the traditions of my fathers or for my ancestral traditions. So this is a zealous attitude of religious devotion, if you want to call it that, that has a surface image of being Torah, but in fact is hateful and even murderous, right? Even to the point of, I mean, we know that he was there watching Stephen being stoned, an innocent person being put to death. So even though the religious leaders were sanctioning this kind of behavior, it was not Torah, right? It was against the Torah. Just like crucifying Yeshua is against the Torah. You don't, to condemn an innocent person on a very simple level is against the Torah. So Paul's zeal here, he's recognizing, and he's using himself first as an example to say, this is how I'm trying to tell them. And then they seem so, they can be very convincing in their zeal. But you have to recognize that just because someone is really zealous doesn't mean it's true. But for a new believer who wants to learn Torah from the nations, and you see someone who's zealous and they're talking about the Torah and purity and true holiness and those Romans and all this, it can be, I guess, that seems like that makes sense. Maybe I need to join these people, right? That makes sense. Yeah, let's get rid of Rome. Yeah, I'll join the group, But lacking any background, you say, well, I'm just coming from, I don't know anything about this because I came from, my parents were sacrificing to Caesar and to, Zeus statues and things like that. I'm all in with you guys. So there is an element of is it like a stickiness or an appeal for certain people to hear this kind of zeal and want to jump in with it. But what it continues in chapter 1, but when he who had set me apart from my mother's womb called me through his grace, he was pleased to reveal his son in me that I would preach him among the nations. I did not immediately consult with flesh and blood, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me. But I went away to Arabia and returned once more to Damascus. So Paul here recognizes that, he says he doesn't consult immediately with flesh and blood. I see that as a moment of wisdom, in that he knew enough. This is back to our tear and our unshrunk patchwork. He wasn't going to go and try to hear other people's opinions right away. He wasn't going to try to go check and double check what the transformation he's experiencing through other people. He needed to go and have some time, just him and the Lord. And he went to Arabia. I think he went probably to find Mount Sinai, right? That's where Elijah went. This was such a radical shift for him, and he knew it to be true. He knew that it wasn't a time where he's evaluating whether or not he trusts Yeshua. It's a time where he's working through, how did I get here? If I grew up learning Torah, and Yeshua is exactly who Yeshua says he is. And now he's calling me to take the gospel to the nations as part of this fulfillment of this covenant to Abraham, that all the nations of the world will be blessed in the gospel, in the Messiah. How did I get, as a Jew with a good Torah education, how did I get here where I'm watching Stephen be stoned? I'm watching an innocent man who just recited beautifully so much Torah and prophets and Psalms, proclaiming Yeshua in front of religious leaders and judges. And I'm there on the side of the people stoning this man. How did I get there? How did I get to where my own teacher, Gamaliel, who said, leave him alone, right? Acts chapter 5, he said, leave alone, because if this is from God, there's nothing you're going to do to stop it. How did Paul's thinking, what is it that I didn't listen to him? Instead, I went to the chief priests and got authoritative license to pursue even more intensely, to arrest, to hassle, maybe even to hand over to be, to worse than imprisonment. I think that's what Paul's doing here. He has to go back. How did I get here? How is it possible that a Hebrew of Hebrews, a Pharisee of the Pharisees, could be 180 degrees out of whack? I'm actually persecuting God's ecclesia. Now, of course, here he's writing, reflecting. There's that passage in, let me see if I can find it here. In the book of Acts, where Paul is telling the story before the Agrippa, and he's giving his testimony of his change. And when he retells it, this is Acts 26. He's talking to the king, and he says, he's telling his story. And he says, so I thought to myself that I had to act in strong opposition to the name of Yeshua of Nazareth. This is Paul the believer telling an account before the king about his past life, before his kick in the rear that he got from Yeshua. So this is Acts 26:9. O king, I thought myself that I had to act in strong opposition to the name of Yeshua of Nazareth. And this is just what I did in Jerusalem. Not only did I lock up many of the saints in prison after receiving authority from the chief priests, but I also cast my vote against them when they were being put to death. And as I punished them, often in all the synagogues, I tried to force them to blaspheme. And I was extremely enraged at them, and I pursued them even to foreign cities. So here this is Paul, and he says, I locked up many of the saints in prison. Did he call them saints when he was persecuting them? He was the saint, wasn't he? They were the enemy. I cast my vote against them when they were being put to death. But now he's able to retell the story. And he said, I was the bad guy. They were the saints. So he's like, how is it possible that a human could be who has a life sprinkled with Torah and the Word of God, be completely wrong? And that's what he's wanting to communicate to the Galatians, because what he said, then this is why he's telling his story first. He says, because there's a bunch of people, there's a bunch of sharks just like Saul of Tarsus. And they're going to sound like they're teaching Torah. And they're going to be zealous. And they're going to have an attitude towards you that that they have the goods, they have holiness, they have righteousness, and you have to do this, this, and this, and maybe they'll let you in their group. Right? Maybe they'll let you in, and then you'll be righteous. And there's something in our fallen human nature that just in the right situation that we would lock into that kind of message. And Paul's warning them of how intense and how convincing these types of people can be, because he knows it firsthand. So then he gives another example in chapter 1. So the first example he gives is of himself, right? The reason Paul he thought he was the saint and he thought Stephen was the bad guy. Because they had a different definition of righteousness, right? Paul thought he was righteous in doing that, in persecuting, in imprisoning, in voting for death. He was justified in his own mind. Stephen had the same word, righteousness, but understood it in a completely different frame. Still pro-Torah, it was still Torah, but it was true Torah. Paul's the one that had a hollow, false Torah until he got the Torah, understood the Torah of the Messiah, which is where he gets at with Galatians. So he says another example in chapter 1. 3 years later, I went up to Jerusalem to become acquainted with Kepha. Who's Kepha? Do you know? Peter, yeah. In Galatians, Paul uses some Aramaic terms, and Kepha is one of them. It just means stone, right? It's just the Aramaic word for stone. So for those who want to learn a little bit of Aramaic, Kepha is the word for stone. And I stayed with him for 15 days. I did not see any of the other apostles except Yaakov. In English it says James, but Paul wrote Yaakov, Jacob, the Lord's brother. And he says that people started hearing the man who, the churches it says, or the different ecclesias, the different believing groups throughout Judea who believed in Messiah, they were hearing that man who once persecuted us is now preaching the faith that he once tried to destroy. And this is amazing. And they were glorifying God because of me. So that means they weren't mad at Paul. Even though this is the person who had probably broken into their meetings, maybe arrested some of them. They know that he was there with the stoning of Stephen, but yet they see a transformed heart, and they know this is the work of God. This is not the work of man, because there's no explanation for Paul. Because we all know who he was, and now we see what he's doing. They are glorifying God because they're saying this is the new covenant transforming a life. And even someone who had that track record that Paul was certainly ashamed of. Like he said, look, they were saints. I understand that they were saints. That if God can transform a person who's that bent on the wrong way, then God can do anything, right? God can transform any heart. In chapter 2, after an interval of 14 years, he went up again to Jerusalem, this time with Barnabas. Barnabas was a Levite. We learned that in the book of Acts. Taking Titus also. So Titus is now as a Gentile, or one from the nations. It says, it was because of a revelation that I went up, and I submitted to them the gospel which I preach among the nations. And I did so in private to those who were of reputation, for fear that somehow I might be running or had run in vain. And this is, I've wondered about this passage because he is, there's a humility here that even though he's confident, he still wants to have fellowship with James and with Kepha, right? So there is a respect here, but he wants to stay in communication, in communion with them. And he says, but not even Titus, who was with me, even though he was Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. What he means to say there is not that Titus never got circumcised. That's not what Paul says. He says no one was bullying Titus. When Barnabas and I and Titus went up and we spent time with James and John and Peter, no one was bullying Titus. That's the way it should be. It's this compulsion. If you were to do a search of this word, this Greek word, to compel, to force, it's the same word used in the Maccabean accounts for what the Syrians were trying to do. They were trying to compel, it's the same exact Greek word, Jews to eat pork. They were trying to compel, and he used the same word in the passage we read from Acts 26, to compel them to blaspheme. The verb has to do with bullying and force, coercive, intimidation, to try to get someone to behave a certain way, which means to bring them under you're their root master now, and they're your slave. And Paul knows now with perfect clarity, he understands the new covenant. He understands this is God's work. That's why he can say that all those ecclesia, the different ecclesia groups throughout Judea, they understand before I did, and they're glorifying God at my transformation because they see that's God working on the heart of the individual, that's not a fruit of the work of man. That's what is the space to be protected for communities in Messiah. He says, so now I'm in chapter 2, verse 4. Yet it was because of false brothers, there were Suda Delphoi, it says, secretly brought in, who had sneaked in to spy on our freedom, which we have in Messiah Yeshua, in order to enslave us. So now we have that word. This is people who are hanging around in the network of, you have James and John and Peter in Jerusalem, and you have a whole network of people. And some of those people, Paul said, there were false brothers there, people who were there, like Jude talks about, right? They're participating in feasts, but they have their own little secret agenda. And they don't see Titus the same way. And they're suspicious of Paul, But what does he say? We did not yield in subjection to them, even for an hour, so that the truth of the gospel would remain with you. But for those who are of considerable repute, what they were makes no difference to me. God shows no favoritism. That's a Torah principle. God is not a respecter of persons. That's why when he trains the judges, who are the qualified judges in the Torah? They're not respecter of persons, right? Every person is equal before the Torah. It doesn't matter if they're a native or a stranger or rich or poor. Everybody is equal before the Torah. There's no favoritism. And Paul cites that point. God shows no favoritism. He says, seeing that I had been entrusted with the gospel, and it goes on, they gave us the right hand of fellowship. So the point is here is, well, maybe I have time to do just the one more. The one more is later in chapter 2 in Antioch, where, and we talked about this last night, where Peter was, now they're away from Jerusalem, but he was eating with Jews and Gentiles who were all eating together regularly. And we know that it wasn't just like one event. The Greek uses what's called the imperfect verb there, which means he would do this regularly, right? That's the Greek text. They were regularly eating together, fellowshipping. And then this bully group shows up, and even Peter himself gets a little like, oh, I got to change what I'm doing because I'm afraid of these guys. And it says, when they came, he began to withdraw and separate himself, fearing those from the circumcision group. And the rest of the Jews joined him in this hypocrisy, with the result that even Barnabas was carried away with the hypocrisy. So again, this is, Paul giving a case study to help the Galatians understand how coercive, how convincing these groups can be, and how important it is to know the core of the gospel. And the core of the gospel is that we belong to Messiah, not by keeping certain rules. Whether it's a rule like, that's in the Torah actually, right? Or if it's a tradition of man. A person could keep the Sabbath perfectly according to the strictest rabbinic law and not even believe in God, really. I mean, they could refrain from all the proper things. They could eat only the kosher food, but not even believe that God is real, right? So that it's the same issue from Isaiah chapter 1, right? There's a temple there, the priests are offering sacrifices, and Isaiah says, these are all worthless. All these things are worthless because your heart is far from me. And so Paul is giving these little, what I call vignettes in Galatians to help build some skill on the Galatians side to discern and to be able to go, okay, wait a minute. I can't just, even though I'm new to this, I'm brand new to this, and I'm pretty naive. I don't even know what I don't know. And I do want to learn Torah. And I love God. I want to walk in his ways. I realize that there's different groups. That's where these sectarian groups set up shop so that they can sell their wares, so to speak, to people who are naive, who don't know, who are going to believe them because they don't have the deep roots to be able to go, okay, let me ask you some questions about this zeal that you have, and to be able to say, wow, that I can see you're really zealous about what you believe. But can we go back to the core of the Torah? So and this is true for all of us, we need to grow in skill of discerning what is the basic gospel message, what is the truth of the gospel, and how does that orient us to dealing with all the noise in the world and all the different things, this religious solutions that people come up with, which are the unshrunk cloth on the tears. Are we at our time? Are we doing questions now? Oh, okay, go ahead. Yeah.
All right, everyone. So I know that Galatians is very, sometimes it gives different interpretations by other believers too, right? We would like to see it in a messianic viewpoint. And I think many of you have encountered fellow believers who are using Galatians as a reference, like, oh, we don't need Torah already because we are believers. So if you have any questions, or feedback, any comments, you are able to please give the microphone to anyone. Well, one thing there too is like Brother Rob was saying that Titus was not compelled to be circumcised, but he was circumcised anyway later on when Paul allowed him also to go to the temple. So these are kind of questions. If Titus was a Gentile, still he shouldn't have been allowed to go into the temple. Right. So, did he go into a proselyte conversion, or just believing in the Lord already made him?
That's a good question. I think he was just keeping the Torah, right?
Brother Wesley, I think you have one.
Just wanted to say too, so one of the other things that I think you would be looking at, and you probably heard this, but one would have been the fact that Abraham believed and was counted righteous when he was in Arabia, and that would have, like Tim Hanks says, I think that would have just kind of blown his mind, like, really? He must have been a place somewhere where he was circumcised and then he believed, because that was a part of, so, you have the people of circumcision where you had to become circumcised. Now you're considered like a proselyte, now you're considered righteous because of the circumcision.
Yeah, that's a great point. If this is a good place where at the circumcision of Abraham, in conjunction with the verse that Wesley just mentioned from Genesis 15, when Paul clearly says he was uncircumcised, right? At Genesis 15. But yet it said he trusted in the Lord and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. And Paul says, see, he's reckoned as righteous independent of the commandment of circumcision. And I think that wasn't like, wait a minute, it's been there my whole life, right? It's just a simple Torah chronology. That the rabbinic Midrash tradition says that Abraham wasn't, they take Genesis 17 where it says, walk before me and be tamim. They look at the Targum there, says be shalem, be perfect. And that's the chapter where he gets circumcised. And so they argue that Abraham wasn't perfect until he was into the Pharisaic, first century. But James says it even differently. James says Abraham wasn't reckoned as righteous until after he had offered Isaac. And which means James dismisses the claim that circumcision helped Abraham in any way. It's the fullness, and this gets back to what we were talking about, the counting of the Omer, right? We're talking about our redemption and then the perfect fruit that comes not on a calendar date, but on a kind of a perfection of 7 sevens, which represent God's timing, perfect timing for the perfect fruit. And so James is going to say, no, it was the verse from Genesis 15, and it was reckoned Abraham as righteous, that is fulfilled in the ultimate, which you could say, testing of Abraham's faith, which is the offering of Isaac, which is a demonstration of Abraham's love for God, and that there would be an example. Well, oh, I finally have Isaac, and I'm going to protect him now, right? Because they went all their life wanting a son. Now they have the son. Is that son going to become an idol now? Like, oh, we don't need to wait on God anymore because we finally have this son. This long wait is over, and now we've arrived. And obviously, Abraham understood that. Well, we learned that from Hebrews. He already knew that in Isaac your seed shall be called, right? So he already knew somehow God's going to have to raise him from the dead. So the picture of circumcision in chapter 3, he says, are you thinking now you began in the spirit? Are you thinking that your perfection is in the flesh? Right? He's and again, back to that, we wait by the Spirit for the hope of righteousness. We're not going to look to joining. I know people who have converted to both ways, to Orthodox Christianity, to Orthodox Judaism, and they have a sense like they've arrived. I've arrived, right? I've arrived, and there's a sense of, and I think that's a false righteousness. Because the fact is, we don't arrive. We don't arrive until Messiah, comes and restores all the kingdom. So we're not in a position of finding that. We just sang the song, this world is not my home. This religion is not my home, right? My walk is with the Lord ultimately, right? That my greatest commandment that we each have, to love God and to love one another. And that is an ongoing obligation. That is the yoke of the Torah. That is what we're called to do. And there's no name of that religion, right? There's no name. It's not really a name. And it's not a sect. Some think, the sect, it was called, there was a sect, the Nazarenes or whatever. But Paul says, which they call a sect. So Pharisees were a sect, Sadducees were a sect, and they were calling, Paul just says this way, which they call a sect. But I believe, Paul would have said, no, it's not a sect, it's the truth. It's the truth of the gospel. And you live your life as a redeemed, just like at the end of Psalm 19, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable to you, my rock and my redeemer. That's the cry of the heart that says, Abba, Father. And there's no word for that for the people whose that is your life. You could say, I am a new creation. I am a beneficiary of the new covenant, right? There's ways you can talk about it, but it's ultimately it's resistant to that labeling. It's not a religion. It's not a sect. It is why God created, and it's the purpose of creation is what it is. It's the purpose of creation. So anyway, that was a long-winded answer.
Okay,
Got a quick question.
Rosie, go ahead.
Would he actually be getting the circumcision of our heart?
Say it again. I'm not sure I understood.
Would he be referring to?
use the mic, please. Use the
Would
mic.
he actually be referring to the circumcision of our heart?
Would he be referring to the circumcision of the heart?
Oh, of the heart. Yeah, absolutely. And you're so right. That is in the book of Deuteronomy. Circumcision of the heart is the poetic language that God gives Moses that is talking about the new covenant. And you notice, here's an important thing. Circumcision is something the father does to the child. Doesn't ask the child's opinion. The child has no voice. It is an irreversible act that the father does on his child, and that's the new covenant. God doesn't say, can I write my Torah on your heart? In the same way, he didn't say, Aaron, I have a job I think you might be interested in to be high priest. Would you like to be? It's a life. If you do it wrong, you're going to die. You know, and it's going to cost you everything. And if someone in your extended family dies, you're not going to be able to, participate in that. You're not going to have any land rights. You're going to be taught. You're going to be teaching people my word all day. Do you want the job? What do you think? I'm going to invite you to this job. No. It's, Aaron, this is who you are now. This is what you're doing. That's Joel.
Well, I don't want to jump ahead, so I want to know if you're planning on talking about chapter 5, verse 3. I testify again to every man who receives circumcision that he is under obligation to keep the whole Torah.
Yeah, that's. I really love that verse, but I think I understand it differently than most translations I've ever seen. It's the whole passage there in chapter 5, and the end of chapter 4 and into chapter 5. Paul twice talks about the whole Torah in chapter 5. He says the verse that Joel just read, and then later he says the whole Torah is summed up in one verse. You shall love your neighbors yourself. And then in chapter 6 he comes back around and says that we're obligated to fulfill the law of Christ, the Torah of the Messiah. I view that each of those instances is the same reference. Those are each talking about the same thing. I differ from Tim Hague on that. Tim Hague reads the one you just read in chapter 5, verse 3, as referring to the traditions of the elders. Like the whole law had to do with like an oral law that's added, and I see it differently. The obligation is for everybody's obligated to the whole. What he's warning them is these people who are adopting a sectarian view are like, back to the Luke 10, they're adopting a narrow definition of who they have to love, of who their neighbor is. They're adopting a specialized in-group worldview that is actually a step away from the whole Torah. And he's reminded them, you're obligated to the whole Torah. And if you join this group, you are abandoning some of the Torah. You're going to be straining the gnat and you're going to be swallowing camels. You're going to be, what are some of the other things? You're joining a group of people who are shiny on the outside. They're really good at washing the outside of the cup, but they have no attention to the inner uncleanness. I would just take every rebuke that he gives of the Pharisees, and he's saying the people that join that group, they're going to be really strict in tithing their dill and their cumin. They're going to be neglecting the weightiest matters of the Torah. And so that what he's saying is that you're joining a group that is neglectful of the Torah, and when in fact you are obligated to it.
I think one of the things about this verse that is so confusing to me and maybe to other people, because earlier in Galatians, Paul made the point that circumcision is from Abraham, it's not from Moses. And yet here we're talking about circumcision and an obligation to keep Torah, which hadn't even been given to Abraham yet. So, you have any thoughts on that?
That's a good aspect too, is this is a good, one of those good verses to pull up like on Bible Gateway where you can see all 50 English and you see the variety of ways it's been interpreted, because it's all over the place. The term Paul is using is, in the Greek, I believe he's using satire. It's the verbal aspect is continual. It's basically saying you who are continually circumcising yourselves. He's not talking about just the physical act of circumcision. He's creating a parody, if you will, of these people. He even says, he makes other comments about them, that it is like a caricature. Like you're by joining that group, you're becoming a caricature. You're joining what Yeshua kind of painted as this caricature, like people who strain the gnat and who swallow a camel, people who are blind and they're convinced that they're teaching other people, but you have a whole blind, and where do they go? They fall in a pit. So Yeshua uses like parody or caricature, satire. It's almost cartoonish, right? Like Yeshua gives us memes in a way. It's like, it's oh, that's silly. The guy's got a block in his eye, right? And he's trying to help somebody who's got a speck. So Paul is adopting a similar, in my view, a similar approach, particularly in Galatians, to warn. He's basically pulling out all the guns, so to speak, to warn these Galatians about where they're headed if they join in with these groups. They're going to become the ridiculed from Yeshua's teachings perspective. They're going to be the ones with the log in their eye going around telling other people to help them with their speck. They're going to be the blind falling into a pit. They're going to be the what are some of the other ones? Straining the gnat, but swallowing a camel. Well, the camel's unclean, right? They're going to be washing the outside of the cup, but the inside is neglected. They're going to be tithing carefully the dill and the mint and the cumin, and yet true justice and the love of God is lost on them. So my view is that's the proper way to read that particular passage and Paul's whole point, that it coheres precisely with Yeshua's clear, sometimes comical or cartoonish rebukes of hypocrisy, but yet in a different register, in an epistle form. Denise.
Yeah, 1 Corinthians 7:19, this here riddle, circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing, but what matters is the keeping of the commandments of God. And this is under, like in my section of the Bible, it says this is all teaching on marriage.
Mm-hmm.
And so unpacking it, is that, what does that have to do with marriage? And is it talking about forcing to be circumcised?
Right, yeah. And so there's 3 different times where Paul says circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing. You know what they are? Circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing, but a new creation is one of them. Circumcision is nothing, uncircumcision is nothing, but the one Denise read, but keeping the commandments of God. Circumcision is nothing, uncircumcision is nothing, but faith working through love. Those are the 3 times. I think 2 are in Galatians and 1 is in Corinthians. But there's 3 times where Paul says this is nothing, and then but this. In each of those instances, the terms is peritome and akrobustia. These are both terms in your Greek word search page. They're like, think of it as gangs. These are, the peritome it's not just all Jews, it's like the motorcycle gang. And the akrobustia really means foreskins. And they are the ones who are get the derogatory, those foreskins, right? So it's like rival football teams or something like that, except you have the in-group. It's not 2 in-groups, it's 1 in-group defining the terms, and then anybody who's not with them is the akrobustia, is they're less than, and we're holier than thou. And that is a social dynamic that people came and they're like, oh, I got to join this group because they're telling me I'm part of the foreskin group, and that they're telling me how shameful that is and how I don't belong. And so now that peer pressure is, especially if I'm brand new to this, I want to be with the inside guys. So then I go and I submit to their authority and I become one of them. And now I've resolved that insecurity. So when Paul says it's nothing, he's saying, he's pulling the rug out from underneath that those people who think they are something because of that. It's the people who intimidated Peter. That's the circumcision. They came to Antioch and they must have had, because this is Peter we're talking about. They must have been pretty intimidating because Peter changed his tune with their presence. When they were not there, he was one way. When they showed up, he changed. And it's when they showed up and he changed was a problem. And Paul says, I've been here. I've seen this before. So when he says it's nothing, and someone's saying nothing, don't let those labels be for you any kind of map of the world. It's not a map of the world. You're not to look at the world this way and then think, I need to be there and not here because I'm not good enough. And once I'm there, I'll be good enough for God. That's why. So he always contrasts it. Circumcision is nothing, foreskin is nothing, but keeping the commandments of God is what matters. That's the religion, God's commandments. Circumcision is nothing, foreskin is nothing, but faith working through love. That's your name, your religion, faith working through love. And the third one, circumcision is nothing, uncircumcision nothing. Which one didn't I say? But a new creation. New creation. Those are the 3 times. So what he's saying is you're used to thinking of your map of the world that they want you to have is this. I'm telling you, throw away that map. Faith working through love, new creation, keeping the commandments of God. Don't let sectarian hostilities disturb your soul so that you feel like you need to join one of these sects in order to be right with God. That's not the terms of the new covenant at all. Don't let someone tell you, oh, you're from the nations, you don't belong. Yeah, I do, because of what God promised to Abraham, that all the nations of the world will be blessed in the seed. And the seed is Messiah. I think you should worry about yourself, whether you belong or not, right? Don't let anybody disturb your shalom. And we could talk about Acts 15 in the same, it's the same problem being addressed in a different historical moment.
All right, everyone. So we are done with this afternoon session, and let us make this quick. Our in thing. So let us have a class picture, and then Brother Rob, maybe you could sit down at the middle in there, and let us take some pictures from this side. So who's going to take from this side?
Pictures? Oh, cool.
Yes. Grab a seat at the center, brother.
Okay.
And then all of you would like to stand a bit.